Thomas Jefferson is a name most Americans know. We know him as the man that wrote the Declaration of Independence, the man who fought against Alexander Hamilton and John Adams, and the man who founded the University of Virginia. But there is plenty of deeds and accomplishments that miss the common culture, and in this video, we will go over Thomas Jefferson's life and presidency. Hi, I'm Gray Bradbury, and welcome to the Presidents of the United States series, where I will discuss the legacies, accomplishments, and lives of all the presidents of the United States, from George Washington to Joe Biden. Now, on to the Sage of Monticello. Thomas Jefferson is arguably better known for his accomplishments before his 8 years in the presidential office, as he lived quite a full life for one man. In 1743, Jefferson was born in a log cabin in Goochland County. However, as a child, his father moved the family to the Randolph Plantation, Tuckahoe. It was there when Thomas received a classical education, learning Latin and Greek, practicing the violin, and studying modern literature and geography. He graduated from William and Mary in 1760, went on to study law, which gave him the political know-how to run as a delegate in the Virginia State Legislature, the House of Burgesses. Jefferson quickly joined in on the rebel fever gripping New England, following various new taxes that were imposed by the British. And he was eventually asked to write the famous Declaration of Independence. Thomas said that he would do his best, and it resulted in a foundational document for the American civilization. The Declaration was heavily influenced by ideas of the Enlightenment thinker John Locke, and that ultimate sovereignty lies with each individual in a given society, increasing each individual's access to what they deemed as God-given rights, but also increasing each individual's responsibility to uphold the tradition and success of the nation, as opposed to that responsibility lying solely with the government. Another key Enlightenment principle that was included within the Declaration of Independence was the notion that all people are created equal under God, something that the founders struggled with themselves, as most of them were slave owners. Jefferson had a complicated relationship with abolitionist ideas, as it seemed through his personal writings and his desires to put anti-slavery clauses within the Declaration that he wanted the issue to be solved in his own lifetime. But his continual reliance on slave labor as a source of his income reveals a contradiction between his actions and his values. He even famously had a sexual relationship with one of his late wife's slaves, Sally Hemings, the consensual nature of which is unknown, albeit how much can one consent in the modern definition if one is deemed property. Sally was fathered by the same man that fathered Jefferson's late wife, so one could imagine that they looked somewhat similar. Jefferson, following the Revolution and the adoption of the Articles of Confederation, was sent to be a diplomat in France, taking Sally Hemings with him, where she was technically deemed a free woman. When Jefferson was called back to the States to act as George Washington's Secretary of State, Sally was with child. During his stint as Secretary of State, Jefferson and Hamilton butted heads frequently, establishing the political rivalry that would go on to be the two political factions of the Federalists and the Republicans. This faction would slowly grow in power over the course of the Adams administration, as John Adams' decisions were not always popular, and Republican newspapers would jump on any opportunity to criticize the government. In a truly un-American fashion, the Alien and Sedition Acts were passed, giving the executive branch the power to find and imprison journalists that were criticizing the Federalist government and depose immigrants during wartime. This was mostly used on French Republicans, and Thomas Jefferson and other Republicans used this as an opportunity to rouse public support to the idea of the pendulum swinging to the right. The plan seemed to work, as the election in 1800 placed Thomas Jefferson in the presidential office, making him the first executive to be inaugurated in Washington, D.C. Thomas Jefferson had three big accomplishments during his presidency: the first cementation of American power overseas, the purchasing of the Louisiana Territory, and he cut the national debt by a third. The first ever overseas conflict involving Islamic piracy and quote-unquote terrorism that the United States involved itself in was all the way back in 1801. The Barbary states, which are modern-day Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya, were essentially pirate kingdoms under the de jure rule of the Ottoman Empire. These states acquired most of their income by either demanding tribute from trade vessels trying to reach European ports, or through capturing crews and selling them as slaves. During the Jefferson administration, the Barbary states aligned themselves with Morocco to take de facto control of the Strait of Gibraltar, and began astronomically raising rates required for tribute. Jefferson wasn't having any of this, so he sent the U.S. Navy, in true American fashion, to put the pirates down for good. It went well for the Americans, as they managed to get to Tripoli, the pirate capital, but in the process they lost control of the USS Philadelphia, costing the U.S. $60,000 to ransom the ship and crew. This was the first time the United States projected military power in the Eastern Hemisphere, something we would not do again for some time. Jefferson doubled the size of the United States landmass by purchasing the Louisiana Territory from good old Napoleon. This was probably the best real estate deal in history, as for a technically small sum of $5 million, the United States acquired both the most fertile and the largest swath of arable land in the world. Talk about a deal. While all of the Louisiana Territory was at one point in Spanish hands, during Napoleon's conquest of the European continent, he got the Spanish government to cede the land back in French hands, to which Napoleon sold it to Jefferson. Napoleon's conquests were fairly bloody and pulled Europe into an Allies and Axis-style coalition of powers that united to weaken French power. Translation: England and France were at war yet again, and the Jefferson administration did not want to suffer any collateral damage from the endless European tug-of-war. During his second term, Jefferson passed the Embargo Act, intending to cut all trade with both powers as an act of neutrality. But the loss in revenue cut into the national treasury and led to more and more smuggling. This slashed most popular support for the president, and he did not run for a third term, getting his Republican ally James Madison to run instead. Following his presidency, Jefferson went back to Monticello and enjoyed a life on the political sidelines. He founded the University of Virginia, and when the Library of Congress burned down, taking the national book collection with it, Jefferson donated 6,500 of his own books to restart the national collection. Thomas Jefferson died in 1826, and personally considered his greatest accomplishments to be the author of the Declaration of Independence, the Virginia Act for establishing religious freedom, and founding the University of Virginia. He put these three accomplishments on his headstone, making no mention of his 2 terms in the presidential office. So what can we learn from Thomas Jefferson? I think the first thing we can learn is to live a practiced life. And what I mean by this is that you have interests that pull you in a particular direction. Maybe it's cars, maybe it's food, maybe it's basketball. Thomas Jefferson followed his interests, and he set aside time in the day to make sure that he was living out his interests. I think in the modern day, we can be very easily trapped into a sort of zombie mode where we sort of just go out through life and watch TV all day and sit on our phone all day and don't really enjoy our existence. I think what Thomas Jefferson would tell you is to, obviously we have to work, but set aside time in the day to do what you truly want to do with your life in a practiced manner. Do it every day, do it every other day, and do it. Set a schedule and do it. And I think by just following your cold interests, whatever those may be, that will result in 10 years later, 15 years later, into a much more fulfilled and rich life. And I think you will look back and be very grateful that you made that first step. It could be anything. Just make that first step. And I think the second thing we can learn from Thomas Jefferson is the complexity behind what you would consider to be a great man. There's a degree of greatness about Thomas Jefferson. He is one of the moral founders of the country. He established the right, in this country at least, that there is liberty, pursuit of happiness, and generally speaking, this is something that America has struggled to live up to, that all men are created equal, and women. Thomas Jefferson struggled with this concept himself, and so did all the founders. But that doesn't mean that they were somehow morally unvirtuous, especially because they were living in a completely different time than we are. It's easy for us to sit in the modern day and coldly judge the past and figures from the past, especially our past. America is going through a period right now of intense self-reflection and harsh judgment. I think with the advent of technology, we can really see the brutal things this country has done, and that has left a bitter taste in the mouths of many, many young people. I mean, how could we exist as a country if we've done what we did to the Native Americans, or invaded countless countries and ruined many different lives all around the world? And this is the problem I think Thomas Jefferson inherits as a figure, because so much, especially when I was growing up, so much positivity and morality was thrust upon him, and in recent years that has been swept aside. He has been criticized harshly, and rightly so. He's a slave owner. He probably raped his slaves. That's a hard thing to wrap your head around, especially for one of our founding fathers. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't judge him on these dark truths, but I am saying that people are exceptionally complicated beings. Humans are almost inunderstandable. Like, I don't understand myself. I don't know what I am. Hardly. My brain is way beyond my realm of understanding. My behavior is way beyond my realm of understanding. Neuroscience has not gotten to the point where we could just map out what humans are with scientific clarity. And these moral hard truths are just a human nature. They're a human reality. And we will probably go back to darker times moving forward. And we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, is what I'm getting at. There are a lot of lessons to be learned from great figures such as Thomas Jefferson, Genghis Khan, Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, Mao Zedong. There are lots of lessons to be learned from them, and we shouldn't toss them out because we're afraid of what they've done. We should look at what they've done and acknowledge it and say, maybe if Stalin didn't brutally industrialize Russia at a rate that killed millions of people, they would not have had the manufacturing capacity to beat the Germans. Maybe if Mongolia didn't unite and basically enslave Eurasia, there wouldn't be a modern world today. Like, we really don't know the effects of these brutal events in history. All we know for sure is we're here now, and we can try day by day to make the world a better place. We should not cast aside these historical figures because we are uncomfortable with what they've done. We should still look for the good, the bad, and the ugly. Well, on that rather pleasant note, thank you for watching this week's episode of the Presidential Series. Next week, we will discuss a more friendly president, James Madison. Until then, toodaloo.